Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, when we talk about okay, so when we talk about Prism Analytics, right? Uh, it is basically it allows you to basically understand or read your workday versus non-workday data together in the same place, right? So it basically gives you. So if I have to define Prism Analytics, okay, so the idea behind Prism Analytics is so Prism Analytics. So the idea is with Workday Prism Analytics, uh, basically an organization's data administrators, data analysts, or the relevant authorized people, they can analyze, visualize, understand um, both workday as well as non-workday data together, right? And you do that not by transferring this data to a third party system, to a bi tool, or to a separate database, uh, but you do that all within workday, which is where you can take relevant actions on the HCM data, right? So the idea is with this, your data administrators and data analysts, they can basically analyze both workday and non-workday data together. Uh, and as I mentioned, and you do that without having to export it to a separate, excuse me, separate, for example, data warehouse. So traditionally, for example, I have experience with SAP, right? And in SAP, there's a separate BI tool, business intelligence tool, wherein you can do a lot of business intelligence statistics. So with Prism Analytics and with tab with discovery boards, Workday is trying to basically make it easier as to how you collaborate your data from different sources, how you transform the data, right, into something on which you can do your analytics, and finally create your visualizations using something called Visits or visualizations, or using your custom reports. And these could be your advanced reports, these could be your matrix reports, or any other reports. Okay, so without having to send this data to a separate or a BI tool, right? Okay, now if I talk about Prism workflow, right? It's a very simple, very easy process. The first part is obviously to get data, right? Which is, and as I mentioned, you can get data from workday sources or and non-workday sources, right? The second part is to prepare data, which is basically prepare data for analysis, right? And there are a number of transformation functions available. So you prepare data by basically transforming it, by basically blending something called data sets from different sources, applying security permissions, and finally publishing data. We'll talk about each of these steps in a bit more detail. And finally, the final step is to analyze your data. And this is basically done in terms of Workday's reporting capabilities. or you can do that again in terms of discovery boards, right? So very simple, clean three-step process. Uh, and we'll talk about each of these steps in a bit more detail now, but also in much more detail as we go through the process. Okay, now if I have to expand this Prism Analytics data management workflow, so Prism data management workflow. Okay, as I mentioned, the first step is to get data, right? So the first part of your Prism Analytics data management workflow is to get data. Now, how do you get data into your Prism tenant or Workday? You do that by creating something called tables or data sets. The first part of your workflow is to create tables or data sets. Specifically, these are called base data sets to bring in data. So we'll talk about what are these data sets in detail. But to begin with, if you want to bring any data into your Prism environment, you want to get this data from outside Workday, you want to get this data from within Workday. You get this data into something called data sets or your tables. So that is the first part of your Prism workflow, right? Okay, so now this environment that I've been talking about. So, for example, when you say I'm doing Prism Analytics within Workday, and when you say getting data from Workday, what do you mean by getting data from Workday into Workday? So, for Prism, Workday has a separate environment, and the environment is called a data catalog, right? If I can quickly show you in the system, just give me a sec. Okay, so this environment wherein you analyze data, both workday and non-workday data, and this is what I mean when I say get data into bring in all the data. So you bring all your data within the Prism environment, and that is called a data catalog. So all your data that you have basically brought in from all the different sources is brought into your data catalog, and this data catalog consists of something called tables. It consists of data sets. So this is your first step. And as I mentioned, we'll see in detail later how you create these tables, how you create your data sets.
So it's part of the tenant, right? It's
It's part
not
of it.
something. Okay. Okay.
It's part of the tenant. So for example, if I have to give an example in terms of EIB, right? So EIB
Mm-hmm.
is created within your tenant, right? But you have
Correct.
to bring data within your EIB, and you do that with the help of a custom report, right? For example,
Right.
when you're sending
Correct.
data. So it's the
Um,
same concept. Okay, so a data catalog, it consists of a set of tables and data sets, right? Okay, so the first part of preparing your Prism data workflow is obviously to get data from into these tables and data sets or base data sets, and which is something you do by creating those tables and base data sets, right? Okay, in the this is if you've heard of something called ETL workflow, which is usually used in the context of uh, analytics. So
no, I don't think so. Hmm.
okay, so when I say ETL, it stands for extract, transform, load.
Load. Okay, okay, okay. So I thought ETL as a tool as such. Okay, but
No, no, it's not. So it's a kind of
okay.
methodology, right? For example, you have
Methodology.
software development methodology. So,
Right,
right.
right.
So in the
ETL
context of
extraction. Hmm.
ETL workflow, this step is basically your extraction step, where you are extracting the data,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay,
right?
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second step is to, so once you have brought in your data with the help of your data sets, with the help of
Mhm.
your tables, the next step, as I mentioned, is to transform and blend and join that data, And you do that by creating something called derived data sets. So in the context of data sets, we'll see later that data sets are of three types. We have something called base data sets, then we have derived data sets, and finally we have the published data sets. So we create derived data sets to basically transform the data, right? And this is where we can basically blend workday data, which could be in a which could be in one base data set, and blend it with non-workday data, which could be in a different data set, right? So this is where we blend, we perform joins, we configure the manage field steps, we apply the calculated Prism calculated fields, and all of those transformation functions that Workday has offered to basically blend Workday data with non-workday data, or even maybe non-workday data with non-workday data. So the whole idea is this is where the entire transformation happens, right? So this is the second step. Now this, as I mentioned, this basically corresponds to the transformation logic or the transform logic within your ETL workflow. Okay, the third step is to apply the appropriate security permissions. We already know any access in Workday, it it so any object in Workday, any table in Workday, any report in Workday, any field in Workday, it is called a secured item, basically because the access to that item is secured, right? So do you have a basic understanding of security domains and
Yes,
domain
yes.
security policies?
Yeah, yeah.
So
I do.
basically, all access to Workday objects. So, or if I have to put it that this way, all objects in Workday. When I say objects, these could be your objects like employees, positions, plans. These could be your reports or tasks. They are encapsulated within domains. So if I need certain access, view access, or modify access to certain objects, I need the corresponding domain security policy permissions. So the third step is to apply security to data, right? And this can be done for both workday as well as non-workday data, right?
Okay.
Uh, okay, so the moment you create bring in data into a data set, right, and even if it is work external data, what workday does is it implicitly applies security, right, to the data within a data set. And the domain that uh, a given data set gets implicit access to, it is called Prism default to data set domain. So even if you don't apply any permissions, you have not applied any security authorizations on a data set or within data within that data set, you'll not be able to access. Workday implicitly applies these domain security permissions. So the idea is only if you have the relevant authorizations to that particular domain or that particular data set, you'll be able to view the data within that data set. So this is an implicit permission that Workday applies, and we'll talk about this in detail later. But then, as I mentioned, we can apply data security permissions, which is basically explicit data security permissions to the data within the data set by using Workday domain domains. Okay, the fourth step is basically make this data available for analysis or analytics, and this is done by basically publishing. the data set. So only when a data set is published, you'll be able to create reports on that data source, right? Or you'll be able to use that data set within your discovery boards, right? So when data set is published, and again, we'll look at this in detail. So when data set is,
So you, hello.
yeah,
You
mhm,
talked about three different data sets, right? So one is derived and the other one is published. So what's the other one you
base,
talked about?
base data
Sorry?
set.
Base
One
data
is
set.
one is base data set,
Okay.
which is your base data, raw data that you're getting from Workday or
Okay.
outside Workday. Then you
Outside.
transform the data, which becomes your derived data sets. And finally,
Mm-hmm.
when you publish that data, that becomes your published data set.
Okay. Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Right? Any which is, we'll look at each of these data sets in
Mhm.
detail. We'll see what are those data
Yeah.
sets, how you create those data sets. So that is any
Okay.
which is. Okay. So when the data set is published, what Workday does is Workday creates, I should probably be using it here. So Workday creates the Prism data sources. So I'm sure when you deal with reporting, you know a data source, right? So every business object, um, basically the basis of your custom reports is a data source, and a data source basically identifies the rows which will be available within your report output, right? So business object, for example worker, it controls the columns which are available on your report. So if I, for example, whether I can check worker's last name, first name, his date of birth, his hire date, so these are all the columns which are available on the report. And a data source, it basically identifies, so it acts as a filter which identifies what rows my report will return. So for example, will it only return active workers, will it return terminated workers, will it return all employees, and so on and so forth. So data source is a kind of a filter that is built into the business object itself. Okay, so what Workday does is when a set is published, so all data sources are Workday delivered. They come with the business object themselves. But when a data set is published, Workday creates a Prism data source. Next, it loads it with the transformed data, right? Applies the security permissions to this data, right? So the moment a data set is published, Workday creates a Prism data source, loads it with the transformed data that has been coming from the lineage, from the pipeline, and then applies all the relevant security permissions. These could be implicit permissions or this could be explicit permissions that we have defined. And the final step is to actually analyze and visualize the data, and you do that using custom reports and discovery boards. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, so for as a flow wise, I'm clear. So it's extract, transform, and load.
Yeah, that is
Um,
something in which we'll talk in detail. So
yeah,
don't
yeah.
worry. Obviously, that is part of the course.
So you talking more on the discovery boards and all that,
Yeah,
right?
I'll talk about
I
it. So
don't.
I wanted to give you a holistic view of what
Mhm.
Prism is, and we'll start with the visualizations. So I'll talk about discovery boards, and then we'll
Okay.
talk about all the other aspects. So as
Okay.
such, if you see earlier, what Workday had done was
Mhm.
discovery boards would only come with Prism, but now
Mhm.
with this release, which is 2020 R2,
So,
uh,
yeah.
discovery boards are no longer coupled with uh, Prism,
Mhm.
right? So you may
Okay.
not have Prism, but then you can still have discovery boards, or once it is enabled, right? And
Okay.
discovery boards can be used to build your reports both on both on Workday delivered uh, uh, data sources as well as on your Prism data sources. So even if you don't have
Mhm.
Prism, you can still build all the reports you want,
Okay. Yeah.
right? Okay, so this is basically the load part, load step, right? So we have the extraction step of the ETL workflow. We have the transformation step, which is basically the derived data sets, and published data sets. These are basically your load. It corresponds to the load part of the ETL workflow. Okay, uh, let's move on and talk about discovery boards. So we'll look at what are these data sets, will how you transform them on all of those aspects in detail later. Okay, now what is a discovery board? Let me quickly navigate to the system and show you. Oh, shit. Okay, so access to your discovery board is enabled through Drive. So if I go to my profile and from there click on Drive, this is where I can see the discovery boards, right? Okay, here I can see this is the overall Drive folder wherein I basically see all the folders, all the worksheets, all the discovery boards, all the videos, everything that I have access to, right? But then there are individual folders as well. For example, all the files that I have created, they would be in this folder. All the files that I may not have created but have been shared with me, right? And when those files are shared with me, I may be given a view only access, or I may be given a view and edit and modify access. So any which ways, all discovery boards, and a discovery board is basically identified by this icon. So this icon, it identifies a discovery board, right? But then if you see, I have other kinds of files as well. So Drive is not purely created for discovery boards. Now it is a home for discovery boards, but the original idea for Drive was it would allow you to store your other documents as well. For example, if you see there is some JPEG image that is stored, there are some MP4 videos that are stored, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so a
So
discovery,
how we got this drive? Is it the Workday drive?
yeah, it is Workday Drive.
Ah, okay. 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 It does look like a Google Drive.
No, no, no. Okay, so you have access to Drive in your tenant? Not yet,
I
right?
don't think
Because,
so. I haven't gone there.
right, because in terms of, if you see, as I mentioned, now for Drive you don't need a special tenant. It can be
Hmm.
enabled on production, sandbox, or any of the tenants.
Okay. Okay. Okay, sure. I'll check that. Yeah.
Okay, so what is a discovery board? So discovery boards, excuse me, basically is an embedded uh, ad hoc. So, for example, back in my SAP days, uh, you have the option to create proper reports, but then there was also a tool which could be done. So the idea was the HR themselves, they can quickly create queries without knowing any coding experience, right? Um, a discovery board tries to serve the exact same function. So the idea is even without having any or much technical understanding, uh, an end user as well. With little training, he can quickly create ad hoc queries for himself, right? So a discovery board, it is an ad hoc embedded reporting and analytics tool within Workday, right? Uh, they basically enable you, so they enable you to perform drag and drop analysis on data within a data source, right? So ultimately, all data exists within a business object, within a data source, within the business object. So even when I'm creating my discovery board analytics, I would be doing that within the context of a data source, right? Now, a discovery board, it basically consists of, so discovery board, it may consist of one or more visualization. So if you have seen a dashboard basically consists of worklets, right? So the individual reports that are displayed on a dashboard, they are known as worklets, right? Similarly, on a discovery board, the individual reports or metrics or analytics that are displayed or that are created or visualized, they are basically called visualizations or simply viz, right? Okay, or a discovery board, if I have to put it this way, it consists of at least one or more sheets, and each sheet may consist of at least one or more visualizations. Now, what are these visualizations? What are these sheets? We'll talk about them um, in detail. Okay, the next thing. So, how are these visualizations created? Mm, okay,
So,
so as I mentioned, mhm,
sorry, can you please help me again on the
mhm,
discovery boards? Because are we saying we will take the data with the data source? Like, what does, I
mhm.
mean, yeah, so that where I got confused. Sorry.
Okay, so how do you create a custom report?
The primary will be a data source. That's the basic which we use. Based on the
Mhm,
requirement, we see what will be the relevant data source,
right?
and we choose that to create a custom report. So, for
Exactly the
example,
same logic,
yeah.
right? So,
Ah,
for example, if I'm talking about worker business object, right, the most common business object. So, if I'm talking about worker BO, this worker BO has a data source. For example, all active and terminated workers,
okay, okay,
right? Now, this data source, if you see it on, and now I'm building a report, let's say REP1, forget about Prism. So on this report, when I take this data source, it will return me all active and terminated workers, right? That's what this custom report does. Make sense,
okay. Yeah, yeah.
right? So the same thing happens with the visualization as well. So here the only difference is instead of report, I'm creating a viz. And what is a viz? A visualization. I'll show you this within
Mm-hmm.
a discovery board. So even a visualization, you can equate a visualization to a worklet. So I'm sure you understand a worklet, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
All right.
Understood.
So a visualization corresponds to a worklet, and a discovery board, it corresponds to a dashboard.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense? So ultimately, when you're creating a worklet, a visualization within a discovery board, you'll have to do that on a data source, right? Because the data source is ultimately what decides what data would flow into your visualization, right? Okay, no
Okay.
problem. This might sound a bit confusing, but once I show you the system, and once we start working on it, things will make sense.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So now, so what happens is Workday has enabled all Prism data sources. So if you remember, and if I can go back, as I mentioned, the moment you publish a data set, Workday creates a Prism data source, right? So a discovery board can be created on any of the Prism data sources. So basically all the Prism data sources that are available, they can be used to create your discovery boards, right? So Workday has enabled all Prism data sources as well as some indexed data sources. So for example, if you talk about all active and terminated workers, you cannot
Mm.
use that within a discovery board because that is not enabled. So only some indexed data sources are available for creating your discovery boards,
Okay.
right?
But
So some
okay.
mhm, questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking. So I okay. So maybe this will come cover later stage. But
No, go ahead, ask, no problem. Mhm.
how do we enable a tenant to Prism?
I'll talk about that. So again,
Okay.
I'm just
Yeah.
talking.
Yeah, that's what. Okay, understood. I felt that this will be covered later, but just
Mhm.
want to
Okay.
check.
Yeah. So in terms of Prism, no problem. Again, just like everything else, it is ultimately a functional area, right? So if you want to enable, for example, advanced compensation. So how do you do that? By enabling the relevant functional area, enabling
Yeah.
the domains within that functional area. So even within the context of Prism, it is basically the same thing, but no problem. I'll talk about that. Okay. So basically, what Workday has done is Workday has enabled all Prism data sources as well as some Workday delivered indexed data sources to be used within discovery boards.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Mhm.
So if you don't have access to Drive within your system, uh, that's because probably the relevant Drive domains are not enabled. So if you cannot find Drive, this is what you'll have to do. So you'll have to go to the task all domains,
Okay.
search for Drive. If you see, these are all Drive related domains, right? Search for discovery board, and these are your discovery board related domains.
Okay.
And these are all part of system functional area. Now, obviously, system functional area would be enabled in your system, right? That is the
Right.
basic functional area, right? Now, these
Right.
are the relevant domains that you'll have to activate, right?
Okay.
So, drive domain, this domain provides access to the new drive user interface to create and manage workday files. So, the only reason I have access to this drive is because my security group. First, this domain is enabled. If I can quickly open this domain, right? So this domain provides access to the new Drive user interface. And if I go to the domain security policy, If you see, I belong to, in fact, in this tenant, all employees have access to Drive, right? So you'll have to first activate the relevant domain security policy, and then you'll have to add the relevant security groups.
So I was just wondering, so am I allowed to do it in the training tenant, whatever they
Uh,
gave,
Probably,
or
yeah.
do I
So it
need to
depends
check with
on
them?
your company policy. So usually, do you have a GMS tenant in your system? GMS or training tenant in
No,
your?
I'm using the Cloud Foundation tenant, whatever they gave it to me. So it's a DPT2 only. I think it's a preview tenant, looks like implementation preview tenant.
Hmm.
So I'm just
See,
wondering, or doing, yeah.
many a times what happens is, for example, okay. So for example, let me come to tenant. Uh, Let me open a different tenant. Enabling a functionality is not enough. Workday. Uh, so let me show an example, right? So if I go to tenant setup, okay, let me go to edit tenant setup assistant, right? Now I go to this. If you see within assistant, it doesn't give me any options, right? Even though I have enabled all the security permissions, and that's because it says you must subscribe to innovation services to use Workday Assistant. So even though
Okay.
this feature, if you see, is available to me, but then the
Mm-hmm.
problem is I cannot configure it because this is a test set tenant, and obviously no agreement has been signed with Workday for innovation services. So many of
Okay.
these are actually innovation services, and just enabling them within the Workday is not enough. Basically, you'll have to uh, uh, subscribe to those services with Workday. So there's something called an innovation services agreement, which an organization signs with Workday, and only
Mm-hmm.
after that agreement is signed, that Workday enables all these features on the tenant, right? Okay. So the first thing that you'll do is, with respect to setting up your drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing is set up tenant and drive, sorry, tenant for drive and discovery modes, right? So the first thing is enable the drive. And when I say drive, as I showed you, there are a number of drive related domains, right? So
Right.
enable all relevant domains for drive and discovery boards. So that is the first thing, right? Um, Make the security policy changes and assign to relevant security groups or your users,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay. The second thing is, you basically identify. So with respect to the drive, if you see, drive is not just a home for your discovery boards. Drive is also a home for other kinds of files, right? So if I go back to drive,
Right.
within a drive, if you see, I had those JPG files. I had, if I can show you, I had an MP4 file and many other files, right? I also have Excel files and so on and so forth.
Right.
So you basically again have to enable them. Now this is usually already done as part of your original tenant setup, but then this is something you'll have to
Mm-hmm.
revisit to check if there are some additional files that you want to enable in Drive. So if you go to tenant setup again, And within tenant setup, if you go to tenant setup system, and within tenant setup system, again tenant setup system, you have the system setup, and within that you have these file type setup instructions. So this is where you basically define all the file types that are enabled within your drive, as well as overall within your workday system. So if you want to use any file type within drive, uh, then that file type will have to be added to this list, right? And how do you do that?
Oh,
It's pretty simple. You just click on edit and then simply
it
add
is.
a new file type,
Okay.
right? So if I scroll down real quick, so either I can say allow all the file types and it doesn't matter what file types are there, or I can selectively go in here and create a new file type. So all I need to do is I'll need to create on that extension and then create some extension, let's say BMP without a
Mm-hmm.
dot.
Okay.
And now this file type can also be used within a drive, right? So it's
Okay.
a very simple setup, exactly like everything else in Workday. Enabling a new functionality is not difficult, right?
Yeah.
Edit, tenant, setup, system. Within that, if you go to system setup section, uh, you basically specify the file type setup instructions. Okay, now how do I create a new discovery board, right? So this is all fine.
Mhm.
Now creating a new discovery board, I can go to my again drive. I have the option called add new. I can click here and here I have the option to create a new discovery board, right? Let me create a new discovery board. Now, as I mentioned, a discovery board, and let's call this 1711, right? So this creates a new template for me, a kind of new dashboard for me with a default worklet added. As I mentioned, a discovery
Mhm.
board may have one or more sheets, and each sheet will have at least one or more visualizations. So what is a sheet? You can think of it as a dashboard. A visualization, you can visualize it or think of it as a worklet, right? Now this is all that you need to do to add a new dash discovery board, and within that a visualization. So we'll stop now. Tomorrow we'll see how you
Mhm.
modify these discovery boards, what are the different options available. Again, obviously this is simply a default, a blank screen, there's no data into it. So we'll talk about all the other aspects tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah.